Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Last episode, we discussed the situation on the ground and the conflict in Ukraine. Now, despite this conflict receiving less attention in mainstream media over recent months due to the situation in the Middle East, there are many narratives and trends that we're seeing unfold. For example, how successful is Ukraine's use of drone warfare? How is Russia being impacted by Ukrainian attacks on its energy infrastructure? And are recent prisoner swaps indicating that there could be some room to negotiate? It's these narratives and many more that we'll discuss in today's episode. The first such narrative that I want to discuss is deep strikes in Russia against energy and other infrastructure. In general, drone warfare is emerging as a low-cost avenue of entry into warfare. This is clear to see in Ukraine's strategy over the last few years, with energy infrastructure especially becoming a more common target for the Ukrainians. Russia's energy industry has been one of its advantages for decades, and so Ukraine is attempting to restrict one of Russia's strengths. The Ukrainian strategy spans across the crude oil supply chain from refineries, depots, and fuel infrastructure. Due to Russia's large landmass, it can adapt its exports, but refining capacity is more difficult to repair and replace. Outside of energy infrastructure, Ukraine is also using drones to target other vital aspects of infrastructure, such as air navigation control centres. Now, a second narrative in connection to this is whether Russia is benefiting from higher crude oil prices. Due to the conflict in the Middle East, crude oil prices have risen. Any crude that Russia sells hence benefits from higher selling prices. But the Russians are also benefiting from restrictions in the crude oil coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. Because nations need crude oil as a vital necessity to the functioning of modern life, nations will turn to anybody if they need it. Because of this, we've seen some nations reduce or delay sanctions on Russian energy products, as we recently saw the UK undertake. However, Russia doesn't capture this entire price upside. Shipping insurance and other shipping costs are often paid by the exporters, so this situation is much more nuanced. Also, because of sanctions, Russia has often been selling its crude at a discounted price. Also, in regard to Ukraine's drone strategy, Russia's energy industry is experiencing some restrictions in activity. So for now, the status of Russia and its energy sector is difficult to gauge, with it benefiting from higher prices generally, but also likely experiencing export strain and higher export costs. The next narrative is one that is relatively under the radar, and that is the seizure of Russian shadow tankers. In fact, in the last few days, we've seen French commandos board and seize yet another Russian tanker. This has been the fourth such seizure since last September. One of the biggest stories in this narrative is the seizure of the Russian flagged oil tanker in the Atlantic back in January 2026. This was undertaken by the United States, which said that it boarded Marinera, which was the name of the vessel, over sanctions violations due to a past shipment involving a Hezbollah-owned company. This vessel was initially sent to Venezuela before then changing course. It was also renamed from Bella 1 to Marinera during its time on the open seas. After the seizure of the vessel, some members of the crew were held by the United States before then being allowed to travel back to Russia. This was a rather unprecedented event, and with the United States aggressing against Iran currently, it might not be the last seizure of a shadow tanker vessel that we see. Another narrative that seemingly arose out of nowhere was Elon Musk cutting off Starlink access to the Russians. It was reported in early 2026 that SpaceX was restricting Russia's use of Starlink terminals. The main takeaway from this was that this move will have limited Russia's view of the battlefield through reduced communication networks and drone usage, while directly benefiting Ukraine. However, one of the bigger takeaways is how vital commercial technology is becoming in military infrastructure. Could this be a modern day expansion of the military industrial complex, with these technology megacorporations gaining even more global influence? The next trend to discuss is the recent Easter truce and prisoner swaps between Russia and Ukraine. The Easter truce and prisoner swaps are likely strategies aiming to boost the domestic environments for both Russia and Ukraine. In both nations throughout the war, there have been reports of hits to morale, with young populations from both nations experiencing huge losses. Outside of the truth of these reports of morale being hit in both nations, which could be signalling or propaganda tools, the families of victims of this war will be feeling pain. Also, mobilization pressure is increasing in both nations. Over time, mobilization is naturally going to get more difficult, as those eager to fight will sign up early. It's also notable that these truces and prisoner swaps could be attempts to gather information, with information of high quality often providing nations with more tools with which they can make decisions. Such strategies such as truces and prisoner swaps can be vital for both Russia and Ukraine to determine the status of the other. Another ongoing trend has been Russia's response to Ukraine's drone warfare strategies. This has typically seen Russia escalate its missile attacks. Recently, we saw the Ukrainians launch an attack that hit an apartment block in Moscow, with the Russians stating that they would pursue a strong response. This response came when the Russians used Oreshnik missiles on Bila Tservka in the region of Kiev. Russia has also been targeting Ukrainian infrastructure for years with these missile attacks, such as power grids and logistic hubs. In connection to Russia's recent strategies, we also need to discuss their spring offensive. Russia's spring offensive started in late March 2026, and it has been deemed largely unsuccessful by some analysts. Even bloggers within Russia have remained relatively muted on the recent strategies, but have noted that Ukraine's damage to energy infrastructure will be costly to rebuild. Sanctions and air defense failures also limit Russia's capabilities to rebuild damaged infrastructure due to a struggle to replace parts. Russia's specific focus in the spring was rumoured to be in Donetsk and Zaporizhia, with Russia attempting to consolidate territory around Pokrovsk especially. However, Ukrainian counterattacks forced Russia to divert assets. The Russians are being stretched by these Ukrainian counterattacks, but as I will discuss in just a minute, a shift in Russian tactics is also seeing the Ukrainians spread more thinly. Early in the war, Russia used tanks and large battalions on the ground alongside their missile attacks. However, Ukraine's drones make the use of tanks and large battalions very costly to the Russians. As a result, Russia is now relying on smaller groups with infiltration tactics. This strategy shift on the ground is likely a permanent one, with drone warfare now a key permanent strategy for the Ukrainians. The shift in Russian strategy is what is stretching the Ukrainians out and making them cover more territory. Now, if we zoom out and focus on some of the bigger picture narratives, one such narrative is that both sides believe that time is on their side. With this war in relative stalemate on the ground, as we discussed last week, both sides are now in acceptance that this war is going to be a long, drawn-out conflict. The fact that this could be a long, drawn-out conflict has now become key to both sides and any hypothetical future victory conditions. For the Russians, they are betting on a slow decline of Western support, especially as other geopolitical issues will see these nations have to solve their own problems. For example, energy price rises that emerge from the Middle East even after this conflict is over could see the Europeans face internal struggles as a large energy importer. This is because the damage that has been done to energy infrastructure in the Middle East isn't an easy fix. Also for the Russians, they continue to experience an energy divorce with Europe, and they recently attacked a natural gas storage facility in Lviv. This also reaffirms the hope of the Russians that the Europeans will have their own problems due to the lack of energy. The Russians also hope Ukrainian fatigue will eventually see them make greater gains on the ground, and that Russia will eventually win this conflict with a larger manpower pool. Ukraine, on the other hand, is betting that Russia will eventually feel economic strain, and that Western support will continue or even strengthen. Ukraine also hopes that its strategies, such as drone attacks, are difficult to defend against, and so it will continue to hold these tools with which it can hurt Russia. The war persists today because both sides see these optimistic scenarios as still having the potential to occur one day. As a result of this, neither side is currently incentivized to pursue negotiation. The side who does approach negotiation typically receives a weaker deal. And because both sides believe that they can one day achieve a better deal than these worst case scenarios, the war, in my opinion, will persist for now. In discussing Ukraine and support, one of the biggest trends in recent months has been the role changing of the United States. Despite Ukraine's individual resiliency, financial, military production, and supply chain support for Ukraine are vital support systems. The United States, despite Trump saying that he would pursue a ceasefire in 24 hours, has now distanced itself from Ukraine somewhat, distracted by the situation in the Middle East. This has painted Europe as the primary support network for Ukraine. But Europe's support systems are fragmented. Ammunition production is slower, and there is little integration across nations when it comes to command structure. Europe is expanding military production, but it needs time to do this, and it needs to be more coordinated. If military structures are successfully integrated across Europe and scaled, the Europeans would be a very strong military partner for Ukraine. However, the question is whether Ukraine can remain resilient for as long as it takes Europe to achieve this, or if Europe achieves military independence at all. The final narrative that I want to discuss is the general trend of more attacks occurring away from the front lines. As we discussed last week, the front lines are quite rigid. As a result, both sides are looking towards logistics hubs, command centres, ammo depots, transport links, and energy facilities that sit in territory further back from the front lines. Again, this strategy will likely remain a permanent addition to both sides' pursuits, since front lines are frozen and more damage can be achieved by striking important facilities behind the lines that supply the front. The worrying aspect about this is that this expands the area of conflict generally. This also threatens to see the conflict escalate and expand across multiple realms of modern-day warfare, and this affects civilians negatively in both Russia and Ukraine. It's many of these forces that indicate, in my opinion, that this war isn't yet over, because neither side has decisive momentum, and they continue to have reasons to fight for a more optimistic future scenario. This conflict has now expanded across multiple realms of modern-day warfare and remains stalemated on the ground. As we look to the future and the potential for negotiation and peace, what does this mean? It's this that we'll discuss in next episode. Putin has recently been stating that he believes the war is near its end. And as I discussed in today's episode, we've also seen both sides agree on the recent Easter truce. Could this be a sign that peace is near, or are both sides signalling and testing the waters? Based on today's discussion, you can likely determine where my opinion lies, but despite this, we will discuss this question in more detail next episode. This will be on Friday. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This really helps out the podcast. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.